Welcome everybody to this second Art History and Visual Studies seminar, webinar of 2021. And this is made possible through the Orion series in Fine Arts. My name is Marcus Milwright. I'm the chair of the History and Visual Studies. And this is a department which has been operating for more than 50 years and has focused on the idea of world art history, global art historical traditions, and also the embracing of interdisciplinary techniques to the study of art. And today's theme is very much consistent with those goals. Before we go any further, I'd like to make the territory acknowledgement. We acknowledge with respect the Lekwungen peoples on whose traditional lands the University of Victoria stands, and the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wasanich peoples, whose historical relationships to the land continue to this day. And it is indeed a privilege to be able to live and work in this beautiful part of the world. Now, I'd like to say, first of all, it's such a pleasure to be able to invite Dr. Ruba Kana'an for this discussion on the question of what Islamic law can teach us about Islamic art and architecture. I'm going to introduce Dr. Kana'an in a few minutes, but I'd like to start by recognizing the support that we have had for this event. It's co-sponsored by the Faculty of Law at the University of Victoria, as well as by the Middle East and Islamic Studies Consortium of British Columbia, that brings together faculty and students from across the province. So as I said, I'll give more of an introduction to Dr. Kana'an in a minute, but I'd like to hand on now to Dr. Alana Lindgren, the Acting Dean of Fine Arts.
Thank you very much, Marcus. Good afternoon. On behalf of my colleagues and our students in the Faculty of Fine Arts, it is my great pleasure to welcome everyone to this afternoon's Orion Lecture by Dr. Ruba Kana'an. Established through the generous gift of an anonymous donor over 30 years ago, the Orion Fund in Fine Arts is designed to bring distinguished visitors from other parts of Canada and the world to the University of Victoria, so they can share their talents and expertise with faculty, students, staff, and the wider Greater Victoria community. The Orion Fund also makes it possible for fine arts faculty to travel outside of Canada to participate in the academic life of international institutions while establishing connections in order to encourage and foster future exchanges. Over the years, an impressive number of visitors have participated in this program. And this afternoon, I'm very pleased that the Orion Fund is making it possible to learn more about Dr. Kana'an's impressive research. So welcome once again, and thank you for being here. I hope you enjoy this afternoon's Orion Lecture.
Thank you, Alana. So I'd like to start just to let people know how we're going to be organizing this event. So it's going to start with a discussion between myself and Dr. Kana'an. And then in the latter part, around about 5 o'clock, we'll be moving into a Q&A section, and that will be moderated by Zahra Kazani, a doctoral student here in the Department of Art History and Visual Studies. So during the talk, please do write your comments into the Q&A section on your screen, and Zahra will be collating those together for the Q&A section. So first of all, let's start with introducing our guest today, Dr. Ruba Kana'an. She's Assistant Professor of Islamic Art and Architecture at the University of Toronto Mississauga, and she has a BSc in Architectural Engineering from the University of Jordan, and then an MPhil and DPhil from the in Islamic Art and Archaeology from the University of Oxford. She's conducted fieldwork across the Islamic world, to list a few: Jordan, Turkey, Yemen, Oman, East Africa, and Syria. And the breadth of that research is also reflected in the range of material that she's covered in her work, from architecture and architectural decoration through to thinking about urban spaces and the relationship between patronage and the development of those spaces, portable arts, signatures, as we'll hear about, and their relationship to craft practices and workshop organization. Before joining the University of Toronto Mississauga, she worked as part of the leadership team of the Aga Khan Museum between 2011 and 2017, specializing in museum management, research, education, and community engagement. In 2007, she created the first accredited online course on Islamic art at the University of Oxford, a very pertinent thing in this environment where we're doing so much online teaching now. And in 2018-19, she was Barakat Senior Fellow in Islamic Art at Oxford University. She's published on many different topics. I'll just pick one or two here. She's one of her articles, The Carved Stucco Mihrabs of Oman, which was published in Islamic Art in Oman in 2008. The de jure artist of the Bobrinsky bucket, patronage and production of pre-Mongol metalwork in Khorasan and Transoxiana, which was published in Islamic Law and Society. And she's done other fascinating work on metalwork as we're here today. One of her forthcoming studies is deals with a talismanic shirt from West Africa in the Textile Museum of Canada. And she's working at present on an important study of legal discourses on the mosque entitled The Friday Mosque, Law, Architecture and Authority in Pre-Modern Muslim Societies. So it's wonderful to have you here, and I'm now going to set you to work on the first question, if I may. The arts and architecture of the Islamic world can be studied from many different perspectives, from art history and archaeology to the scientific analysis of artifacts. Scholars are also fortunate to have a wealth of primary sources to augment their interpretations of the physical evidence. One of the most important areas of Islamic scholarly writing deals with the formation and interpretation of Islamic law. Until recently, art historians have made rather limited use of this fascinating literary corpus, perhaps partly from a suspicion that the treatment in legal works of art and architecture and of the artisans who made them had little in common with the day-to-day realities of patronage, manufacture, and consumption. Could you start our discussion by giving us a sense of what legal genres are pertinent to the study of Islamic material and visual culture, and how we might use them most effectively?
Well, thank you, Marcus, for inviting me, and thank you, Dean Lindgren. I'm going to share my screen with you because I prepared some slides to help with this discussion. And I think what I want to start with is to answer your first question is by giving you a little anecdote. In the 10th century, the famous historian At-Tabari, who lived in Baghdad, tells a little story about Abu Hanifa, who is the eponymous founder of the Hanafi school of law. This is the school of law, the Sunni school of law, with the majority following, the largest group of following in the world. So he tells the story of Abu Hanifa. He says that Abu Hanifa was in Baghdad in the 8th century while the city of Baghdad, the round city of Baghdad, was being built, and that he was responsible for deciding the size of the bricks in the building of the city. Now, we can definitely say that the legal scholar Abu Hanifa was not doing an aesthetic job there, but that his job is probably deciding on things related to distribution of materials, to allocation of funds, and so on. But what this tells us, this puts the legal scholar in the world of the building of the main monument of the time, in the center of architectural patronage and production of the most important monument in the 8th century in the early Islamic, in the Abbasid capital, Baghdad. So for me, I take this idea that now I always think about as Abu Hanifa's brick as a metaphor that legal scholars are in the middle of the world of things. They use things and objects to discuss ideas about law, to explain rules about law. And art historians like us look at these objects from the perspective of art and aesthetic. So we are looking from two sides at the same type of object. Where I would perhaps, if you allow me, disagree with you a little bit, Marcus, is yes, there's been some reticence about accepting Islamic art as a source for the study of, reticence in accepting Islamic law as in the study of Islamic art. But if we think a little bit backwards, we find that actually historians of Islamic art have been engaged with some aspects of Islamic law. So for example, we have numerous studies based on waqf, for example, endowments of buildings or building complexes that are documented in these legal documents that become part of the study along with the physical manifestation of the architecture itself. We have numerous of these studies and they've been very successfully used and increased our knowledge tremendously since the opening of archives in Istanbul and the Mamluk archives elsewhere. We also have manuals like the market inspector manuals. These are manuals talking about the transaction of goods in the market, what is allowed and what's not allowed in the market, and they're written sort of on behalf of the market inspector. And you yourself, Marcus, have published on that. And I think those two, the endowment documents and the market inspector documents, are one manifestation or two manifestations of a larger body of legal document, which is the substantive law manuals. These manuals, and I'll come to them in a minute, these manuals are in a sense, these are sort of a much larger corpus of rules on concrete issues that are dealt with, that are written by the major jurists of the time. And each generation in each different location, the major jurist will revise these manuals and put relevant examples for the context in which he's writing to develop these manuals. So I think that the change and the new thing is the use of the substantive law manuals, and this is one of the main sources I'm using, for example. Another source that is important, and again, it's been used for a while, but I think the idea now is to use these sources in conjunction with the material culture itself and come with new interpretations and ideas. Now, the substantive law manuals, which I think are going to open a whole new area in the study of Islamic art and architecture, are, in a sense, they have a general structure that is divided, that covers two main areas of daily life. One is acts of worship, which deals with issues of faith, of the how to apply the aspects of worship, modalities of different forms of worship like prayer and pilgrimage and so on. Separate from that, there's a whole different division in those substantive manuals that is related to transactions, and it deals with all sorts of transactions. So whether these are transactions between individuals and objects, buying objects and selling objects, or between individuals hiring other individuals to do things. So for us as art historians, both of these branches in their separate specializations are relevant, because with the acts of worship, even though there is no discussion of mosques as such or buildings that fulfill a religious obligation as such, there are very few references, but there it's no discussion of the architecture, but the discussion is of the modalities of prayer, and I'll come to that in a short while to give an example. In transactions, we're talking about the making of objects, the selling of objects, the materials involved in objects, and there is, I think, a clear separation between in the approach of object. One is the types of materials that constitute the making of an object historically, and the other one is the type of exchange that is related to that object. So one deals with materials and techniques and how the object is made, and the other who is making the object, who is paying for it, is it being offered for sale in the market, or someone is going to commission it. And these are very useful in a sense of context for the art that we deal with and we love so much. I'm going to just take a few minutes to give you examples of what treasures are in the substantive law manuals that have not yet been addressed, that are waiting for us as a field of art history to explore and look at and expand our current knowledge with material that comes from the context where these things were being made and used. For textiles, for example, there is the legal concern there is that you have objects made of two separate materials. The substructure, which is the warp and weft, if you like, of the textile, could be of a different material than the embroidery or than the material that is applied, whether it's a lampas, for example, where you have more than one warp and weft. And there the concern is, the main concern of the transaction is how can you guarantee that in the exchange of this object, there isn't what is called riba or unlawful gain, that if people are exchanging these goods, they're exchanging it to a fair value, and there isn't sort of that extra gain that would be questionable, or that there is a risk, the risk and uncertainty that would be not beneficial for people in the market. So while we look at it and we look at the style, the technique, for example, in this linen on the right, on the left, we look at sort of these holes that are created by the pulling of the warp and weft. For the legal scholars, his point is, this is handmade. How many threads are pulled? Does this change the material? Can I create something exactly the same? How would I guarantee that the value is equal? When it comes to something like lampas, you are having not only a different substructure, but also you have, for example, threads that are wrapped with metal, sometimes wrapped with gold thread. So these questions become very important. And in textiles, I know, for example, of one doctoral thesis that has just been finished in Switzerland that touches upon how much legal sources expand our knowledge, because they tell you, they describe the textile, tell you what it's made of, and that for example, the Harawi type of textile, a name of textile, is made of this type of warp and this type of weft and how many knots. It's very detailed because they want to talk about equal value. Another area that is fascinating and not touched upon yet at all, there is so much in the literature on shoes and sandals. The concern there is not the style or the technique. The concern there is a shoe or a sandal are made of a lower part and an upper part that are linked together. So they could be two different materials. The sole is a different material than the cover of the shoe or the sandal itself. Are they glued together? Are they stitched? And throughout reading, you have a sense that the scholars are being very detailed. The jurists, the legal scholars are being very detailed in their description of the styles of shoes and sandals that are being used, for example, in 11th century Mawara al-Nahr in, for example, modern day Turkmenistan. And this type of evidence is something that's only available to us through these sources. Another example that the scholars are concerned about is design and design specifications. If this, for example, here on the left is the doors of a wooden pulpit inlaid with carved ivory made in 14th century Cairo. Now this has, the front part is rosewood, the back part is mulberry. Then you have these designs, these fantastic star-shaped designs with infills in carved ivory and different types of wood forming the design. Who decides what the design? How can you order something? Who provides the materials? Who owns the copyright? Who, in a sense, who can guarantee when in the time of manual labor that that you get what you order? And these are the questions that the legal scholars ask. For us as art historians, we not only visualize, we have access to the material, and we can, if we look at scholars working in specific periods, in specific times, and we look at the material culture, our knowledge is much richer. The last example I'll give you about these legal sources is metalwork, something I'm both passionate about and published a lot about. There, the clarity with which scholars talk about metalwork, this is in a sense the pre-modern plastic, the thing that everyone uses. This type of viewer or picture is of regular use, even though this one is very decorated. In the market, they could be plain ones. The scholars are concerned with the jurists are concerned with two things in relation to these ewers. One, and they say it clearly, is that this is made of different parts. This is sheet brass that is made of an alloy that is shaped by fire, made by hand manually, and as a result you cannot have two sheets that are exactly the same, exact match. And then they are shaped by hand, and not only they're shaped by hand, the base, which we can see here, is clearly a cast base that is added to this sheet body, and the handle is added later, and this is a later spout, so it doesn't count. So it's composite of different parts that would have been made separately. In addition, you have these elaborate decorations on the surface of the object that are made by carving out some of the brass and, in a sense, copying the design on the surface of the object, and then hammering in silver, either in a wire or pieces, to create these amazing designs. Here we see, for example, pieces of silver have been removed. So for a jurist, for me, I look at this and think, this is gorgeous. I can talk about style. I can talk about technique. I can talk about patronage. What does it mean? Who has ordered it? What visual language it conveys? For the legal scholar, they look at it and they think, this is a problem. This is a problem both on materials, and this is a problem of how was this done? Who ordered it? How was the craftsman compensated? Was the craftsman given a design to copy? And then if it's one of their main issues, if it's destroyed while the person is working, who has the financial liability? So in short, Marcus, the sources are multiple. There is no section that's called metalwork and a section that's called sandals, but in their discussions of transactions between humans and objects, then suddenly there's material for us art historians to work with.
Thank you. I think that's a wonderful answer. That's a wonderful answer. And I think you've given us a great sense of, the types of sources which are available, but also what it is they're really getting at, because they're not talking as art historians, their interests are elsewhere. And what I also particularly like is that this covers not just the great masterpieces as we now see it of Islamic art, but also much more humble objects. Their viewpoint was so broad in that respect. Thank you. Let's move on to another topic. So I'd like to move on to an examination of the ways in which legal writing is used to understand workshop practices, as you've already alluded to. What may be broadly called signatures do occasionally appear on portable arts of the pre-modern Islamic world. A rich resource of these inscriptions is in decorated metalwork, and this is an area that obviously you've covered in your previous publications. Could you share some insights into the problems we encounter in interpreting the names that appear on inlaid metalwork from centers such as Herat in Afghanistan and Mosul in Iraq? and the insights that can be derived from a consideration of legal discourses on contracts and related matters.
Thank you, Marcus, for this question. As you know, signatures is an area that I published on, but continue to think about and raise questions about. And in a sense, when I first came across this discovery that there's a whole world of sources that may increase our knowledge about metalwork, I didn't at the time imagine that we will be able to explore more about ideas of sort of workshops and artists. Who is the artist? Because of course, Islamic art, especially of portable objects like metalwork, is not commonly signed. And most of the times we do not have names of artists. They're invisible people in the art that we deal with and we have the privilege to work with in our museum collections. I think I should say that by pure chance and accident, I came across a discussion of a legal contract related to how objects can be commissioned. And they were written by someone who is based in modern day Turkmenistan. So he's based in the Fargana Valley, the 11th century scholar, Sarakhsi, legal scholar Sarakhsi. And of course, as I was reading this, the thing that popped into my mind immediately is this bucket that you see on the screen, the Babrinsky bucket. It's one of the most iconic pieces of early medieval metalwork. It is iconic for many reasons. And one of the reasons, it's the earliest inlaid metalwork that we know of that is so detailed. Of course, there were bits and pieces before that, but this is, as you can see, this is a tiny bucket. It's like 18 centimeters. It's very small, but if you can see, it has these 5 different rows of decoration created with the details here by carving out the surface of the bronze and inlaying silver and brass in it. And here we have, for example, one of the details in this row with 2 individuals playing what seems to be backgammon. In this place here, the silver is removed. So for me, this brings together all these ideas of what is there's someone writing around the same time. He's talking about metalwork quite a lot, giving lots of examples. And I have this object, and on the rim of the object here, there are the names of 4 individuals. One who is said to have ordered the bucket. And then they give us at the end of the 4, the name of the person for whom the bucket was ordered. And in between these 2 is a person who's supposed to have cast the bucket. The bucket is cast bronze. And the person who is acknowledged as the naqash, or the artist who engraved, so what we assume decorated the bucket. So for me, here we have 4 individuals. We usually don't have signatures. Here we have 4, and we have an object that mentions these 4 in a very strange way, because we have many of these similar shape and form of this bucket in museum collections, decorated in different way. There's nothing unique about this bucket. So to have the name of the person who cast it in the main signatures, and it's sort of in the middle between the person who ordered and the person for whom it was ordered, was strange. And it's the first time that we have the name of the artist linked to the name of the patron in inlaid metal work. And by working through the legal texts, I looked through what are the different ways in which this object could have come into being. Was it ready-made in the market? If it's ready-made in the market, why don't we have anything remotely similar in the corpus of metalwork of that period? Was it something ordered in advance? And if it's ordered, what is the role of the person who is designated as an artist here? Did he create the design? Did he just apply the design? Did he provide the materials? Who has the financial liability? And more important, who has the intellectual property? Who is the artist? Is it the craftsman who inlays, who does the silver work here? Or is it the person who supplies the design? Are they both the same? Of course, after a very long study of this object, I came to the conviction that actually this is a sign of a workshop, and that these two metal workers seem to be part of a same workshop, even though casting requires a different, in a sense, type of workshop for smelting and for casting, where but it's clear that the caster and the inlayer are working in the same workshop. And also, if we look at the name of the person who ordered the object and the person for whom it was ordered, here he uses a name, Rashidi, which implies that he has a sort of relationship, either of employment or some sort of affiliation with the person for whom this was made. So I came to the conclusion that this is a workshop. And of course, I remain open to the idea that it may not be, but I haven't seen anything yet to tell me that this is not a workshop. So I started looking for these metalwork objects where we have affiliation or names more than one artist affiliated to each other. And of course, the other obvious place for that is Mosul in the north of Iraq in the early 13th century, where we have these elaborate, beautifully decorated object. The last count of them that we know belong to or come from Mosul in Iraq are around 35 pieces. We know of 8 of them we know that are specifically linked to Mosul. We know the names of many artists, but it's the only part of the corpus of metalwork where we have an artist referring or giving his name in affiliation to another artist. So for example, we have this little box. This is a tiny box. It's the size of a pill box now, which is now in the Benaki Museum in Athens. The artist signed his name is Ismail ibn Ward, as tilmiz, which is an Arabic word that means student of a certain Ibn Mawaliya. Now we know Ibn Mawaliya because there's this ewer in the Louvre Museum that is signed by Ibn Mawaliya. It's his work. We also have another object signed by someone called Qasim ibn Ali, who refers to himself as Ghulam of Ibn Mawaliya. So we have these two referring to themselves as working with Ibn Mawaliya, whom we know he's an artist, and mentioning his name in their signature, yet they're referring to themselves in two words that have very broad meaning that we generally call apprentice or artist, because we just don't know what they are. So when you look from the legal sources perspective and you look into the types of relationships that we have, it becomes clear that actually Ibn Mawaliya had clearly a workshop where he has different types of relationships. This Ismail ibn Ward was clearly a free employee. So he was a free student who worked in that workshop, continued to use the signature of the pride and solidarity that creates a workshop by referring to your master or to your teacher. Whereas someone like Qasim ibn Ali, who refers to himself as a ghulam is a very problematic word that generally means a male of a subordinate nature. So someone who's younger, a youth, a child, a slave, an employee, even a soldier. So the big question is, was this Qasim ibn Ali a slave or a free person? And this opened the idea that workshops had people of individual different status within the larger workshop. But there is a sense of solidarity that, of course, we know it is a workshop from the relationship. There's a for object in that workshop, but it's not signed, but from the stylistic relationships in the motifs on these objects, the sizes and forms of the objects that are made, and also in the signature that refers them to the master of the workshop. Unfortunately, we still don't know anything about Ibn Mawaliya, except that he was working around the year 1200. So signatures are very important, but we don't understand the implications of the composition of workshops without trying to understand who gets to sign, because a slave can't sign his work because he doesn't own the work in a workshop situation. So for that person to sign his name, he would have been a different status of slavery. And now we know that we have what we call the craft trained enslaved people, who are usually given a contract of say 2 to 3 years to buy their freedom through their skill. So signatures is one of the areas that Islamic law can tell us quite a lot to understand what they are on objects. Marcus, you're muted.
Okay. Sorry, thank you. I think this gives us such a kind of nuanced picture of workshop activities, and it strikes me that we've often kind of co-opted sort of European-derived terminology to describe how people interact, which clearly we have to rethink very seriously when the evidence is available of it. So I'd like to sort of shift now on to another area. So some of your current research focuses on architectural dimensions of Islamic law. The congregational mosque, often known as the Friday Mosque, is a central component of the Islamic architectural tradition. And Muslim ruling elites have prioritized the construction, expansion, and renovation of these mosques. And they're often described in contemporary written records. So given the ubiquity of the congregational mosque in Islamic society, it might seem surprising that there's a value in studying the evolution of legal thought on this topic. Could you give us some introductory observations on why you think this is so important? And perhaps also reflect on the insights that legal discourse bring in the evaluation of other building types in the Islamic world.
Thank you, Marcus. This is the topic of a book that I'm working on. So I'm deep into the topic of the Friday Mosque. And in a sense, as art historians, we are, this is the most important monument that we study. The congregational mosque is usually the focus of patronage, whether it's the sort of caliphal patronage or elite patronage. It's where we have lots of evidence. They are very well preserved. They're very rewarding to study because they're beautiful. They're the place where all the innovation in art and in architecture are found. And again, there's so much both historical and literary evidence about them. So they're fun to work with. They're very rewarding. I've always found it fascinating that that we have these monuments are great, but we have very few in the first 500 to 600 years of Islam. And it always was lingering in the back of my mind that there seems to be a phase where there was a huge increase in the number of Friday mosques. And then I've had as most research starts with a chance visit, I was in a visit in Oman, and then realized that when I look at historical buildings, there are no congregational or Friday mosques, except handful. You really can count them in a country that is as large as the United Kingdom, for example. And if you look in the modern nation state, they're everywhere. So I became curious and I started looking at them. And of course, because they're so seductive and beautiful and we have information about them, we tend to think of them as they've always been there. Now, the other side of that is Friday prayer is an obligation in the Quran. We start with the acknowledgement that, for Muslims, this is something that they do on the Friday, that it is mentioned as an obligation. Now, the other thing to know is that even though the Friday prayer is mentioned as an obligation, all acts of worship, as we've seen in the legal substantive law manuals, the modalities of how these are done and the discussions of when and where and how and so on comes as a reflection on how the Prophet and his companions used to carry out these prayers. So I started in a sense, graphing where and when these Friday prayers were built. And I realized that actually in the early periods, in sort of all the way up to the 11th century, we seem to have these large mosques that have, for example, the Mosque of Samarra in Iraq. These are huge size mosques, and they're surrounded by this empty area that is called ziyada, and it's for the spill out of, on the Friday when you have more worshippers than the space inside, people can fill the space outside. Here we have the same idea of this space in the Mosque of Ibn Tulun in Cairo. And then we have, in that early period, we have these mosques that expand in a very organic way. These are the only Friday mosque, the only congregational mosque in these areas. And they start expanding in ways that are organic. I have the example here of the Azhar Mosque in Cairo, but the same can be said of Cordoba Mosque in Spain or the Isfahan Mosque in Iran. This notion of the expanding mosque pushing for space around it, whether that space is regulated space or organic space, ends at a very specific period of time. And then you have this sort of, for lack of a better term, explosion on the number of Friday mosques. So while I'm actually writing something separate from my book on the meaning of that concept, it is through looking at legal sources that I can now ascertain that actually both the regular and the organic expansion around the mosque reflect a very specific idea about the modality of the performance of Friday prayer and when and where Friday prayer can be performed. Now, to clarify how we took it for granted that, of course, Friday mosques were always there and they were always built everywhere, and every city had multiple Friday mosques and all Muslims went to do Friday mosque. When you look at something like Cairo, in the first 600 years, so from the conquest of Cairo by Muslims in 641, all the way until actually the 1270s, we had the total of 4 Friday mosques in the full multiple urban centers that are metropolitan Cairo. And in fact, there is a stage where there were 2 mosques under the Fatimids, and when the Ayyubids came to power after that, in the end of the 12th century, they closed one of the 2 mosques. So Al-Azhar Mosque was closed for Friday prayer for 100 years. So you start exploring why. And it is very clear in that section in substantive law that talks about acts of worship. When it talks about Friday prayer, it differentiates between the everyday regularly obligatory prayers and the congregation prayer on Friday. The everyday prayers are obligation on everyone. The Friday prayer, it seems that the nature of the obligation was originally for people who, not for everybody. The Friday prayer has to take place, and it's a type of obligation that if some people did it, it is sufficient for people in general. It is for, in a sense, actually sources refer to it as iqamat al-shi'ar, to create a symbol for Islam and for the presence of the caliph or his representative as by delivering the sermon and the prayer. So something changed in the middle of the 13th century that made the number of Friday mosques increase. And here we have Cairo in 1277. Each dark dot here is a Friday mosque. And here we have it in 1571. The number of mosques increased from 4 to 150, according to Maqrizi, who was writing in the 14th century. So as you know, Marcus, this is the period, if you think in between we had the Black Death, the population of Cairo is reported to have been reduced by at least 1/3. So there is no real physical need for the number of Friday mosques. And if one wants to talk about the physical need, we know that prior to that, for example, I wouldn't use Samarra as an example, in Al-Azhar or Ibn Tulun, travelers and people describing will always complain about people praying in the street because there isn't enough space in the Friday mosque. So by doing research both on the physicality of the mosque and then when and where these Friday mosque, congregation mosque were built, I came to realize that actually the concept of the Friday mosque has evolved, and what we now take for granted and think as something that is fixed in the landscape of the study of Islamic architecture has major evolutions. And it is different according to the different schools of law. So my book covers Sunnis and Shias, for example, who had different concerns about the Friday mosque. So that jump that we have here in the 13th century within a Sunni context, in the Shia context happened in the 17th century. And in the Ibadi context, which is the third school of law, a minority school of law in Islam, it happened in the late 19th, early 20th century. So again, we took so much of our knowledge about Islamic architecture for granted because we've always had this generalization that places of worship in Islam are two types: congregation mosques and regular mosques, and there was no question about them. For other types of buildings, your question is now, the last question, part of the question was, how does that implicate other types of buildings? Now, these multiple new places of worship of Friday prayer in Cairo are not all mosques. This is the time where the Friday prayer first started happening in these architectural complexes that include a place of prayer, a madrasa for religious education, a Sufi convent. So it changed the nature of where Friday prayer can happen and increased the number of these complexes, and had a major implication on the architecture of these minbars, or the pulpits, from when and where Friday prayer take place. So again, it just gives us a different way to reassess how our assumptions are, again, still based on ideas that perhaps are more informed by Orientalist views about what Islam and Muslims are.
Great. Well, I think I'm certainly looking forward to seeing the book when it comes out. It's going to, I think, give us some really important new perspectives. Before I ask the last question, I'll just mention we'll be moving into the Q&A. So please do take the opportunity to write some questions for Ruba. So my last question deals with some related issues. So starting in the early part of the 20th century, scholars in a range of disciplines engaged with a debate about the character and component parts of the archetypal Islamic city. While this activity has brought to light many useful insights into the functioning of Islamic urban societies, particularly in North Africa and the Middle East, the central premise, the very notion of an idealized Islamic city, has been the subject of extensive criticism, particularly for its Orientalist and colonial origins. Could you sketch the outlines of this long-running debate and discuss the terminology actually used by Muslim legal scholars to define what constitutes a city?
Yeah. Thanks, Marcus. This is also a fascinating topic that I am rethinking as I'm reading these legal sources, because one of the biggest critiques about the idea of the Islamic city was that there's no legal definition of a city. Let me start from sketching the idea. As you mentioned, the 19th century saw extensive studies of cities, especially by French sociologists and anthropologists, of cities primarily in North Africa. And based on these cities, there was a sketching of an idea that the Islamic city has a physical stereotype that translates the idea that was seen by scholars in North Africa. And I chose here just to show you an example of that model from the city of Fez, where the stereotype is a city has walls, has different neighborhoods traversed by these streets that meet in the Friday Mosque, and around the Friday Mosque you have the markets, and you have, you know, bathhouses and maybe small neighborhood mosques, and that constitutes the city. Now, those studies were real studies of real places. So the critique maybe was not, for example, that the brothers Marseille did a study of cities in North Africa. The critique was that this idea of a form and shape and a form and a morphology of a city in North Africa was taken to denote any urban Muslim conglomerate anywhere in the world. So that notion that, well, Muslims, wherever they are, Islam as a religion shapes everything about them. And as a result, it shaped their cities wherever they are. Now, that the methodologically, what this does, it flattens the Muslim world, takes away the nuances and differences between different people. It ignores cultural nuances, it ignores heritage, it ignores climate and environment and so on. And as a result, it is a reflection of Orientalist ideas that is more comfortable with presenting a normative idea about Islam and Muslims. This sort of myth of the Islamic city was, in a sense, deconstructed by scholars in the 80s, especially Janet Abou-Lughod in a famous article, where she, in a sense, looked at the development or the evolution of this idea of the Islamic city and what constitutes this classical model. And there were two models, one for North Africa and one for Syria. And looking at these models, she dismantled, in a sense, the fixed truths about that model and showed that actually it is people basing these research off each other to create a comfortable idea of the single model. Now, what happens as a result of that, you know, the 60s and 70s, so multiple conferences and publications about the Islamic city. Is there an Islamic city? And as a result of Edward Said's publication, Orientalism, and then later the dismantling of that model by Janet Abou-Lughod, there was this discomfort of discussing the Islamic city altogether, and the assumption that the Islamic city as a model, as an idea, as an analytical model, maybe should not be thought of in a large way, and that people should continue working on a city at a time, looking at the evolution of certain places, looking at the context and the content of that development, because Muslims, after all, are different in different places. They have different approaches, ideals, you know, without either geographic or historical determinism. And since the late 80s, we really haven't had anyone raising the question of the Islamic city broadly again. Does it exist? Because the big idea was, if it existed, it would have been there would have been a state definition of what a city is and what a town is. There would be a state definition. Lo and behold, there is actually a definition. Now, legal scholars have defined the city for many purposes, and their definitions are, you know, not always the same. There are three different broad areas that I'm aware of. There may be more, but these are the three I'm working with now. Three different areas where Muslim scholars are discussing the city and defining the inside and outside the city. And I'll give you an example in a minute. One is related to prayer. You know that section about the acts of worship in those substantive law manuals? It discusses what counts as travel? And because if someone is traveling, they can shorten their prayer or combine two of the daily obligatory prayers together, for example. And for that, they define what constitutes inside the city, what constitutes the suburb, what constitutes a village, what constitutes being away in the wilderness. So there is a very clear discussion based on when can Muslims shorten prayer. The other area is where and when can they pray Friday prayer? Because historically, as I showed in the example, there was one Friday mosque only in the city. Beyond the borders of the city, you couldn't build Friday mosques. So in a sense, outside the wall, there were no mosques. With time, there was the question of what about the area that's just outside the wall, what's called the fina, which is the area that has the place where Muslims pray for the Eid, the area that has the cemeteries, the area that has the place for training horses. That border of the city, is it part of the city or not? Can someone perform Friday prayer there? Can someone build a Friday mosque there or not? So there's a big discussion of the city in these sections. And this is ubiquitous among the different schools of law. The third aspect is tax. How do you tax people inside the city and outside the city? And what constitutes outside the city? So there is this big discussion about the city that still needs to be explored. I'm currently writing a short article on Damascus. It's related to the Friday Mosque on Damascus for an edited volume on Damascus that deals with this issue. Those have been approached till now only by scholars in Islamic law, especially Babar Janssen, who teaches at Harvard. And he looks at them from a single school of law, and he looks at them as he has two famous articles, one about the definition of the city through looking at a term, al-Misr al-Jami', and how that term changes over time. And I think what we as art historians can do is match together or bring together the definitions he's talking about with the cities we know the scholars he quotes are working in. Because I think then there will have a more complex idea than we have, say, 5 or 6 definitions that Muslim jurists identified the city based on its mosque. As I know, Marcus, you've also written on this. So I think we as art historians have the knowledge of the material that working with legal scholars as legal texts, and this is where working in a sense in collaboration brings more to the table. And there is the beginning of a recognition that actually legal scholars are working with these texts and familiar with these texts, but they don't understand the examples that are given because they're not specialists in material, and we are specialists in the art history of these materials, but we don't sometimes understand how they came into being or what are the potentials of the issues that they would raise. So this is where I think that Islamic law will be very beneficial for the study of Islamic art and hopefully can open new ways of inquiry.
Thank you. I think your call for collaborative research is so important here, because there are so many areas of Islamic kind of written production which require that specialist knowledge.
Yes.
To understand what's being referred to often in what seem like straightforward terms, as I think you've demonstrated so well throughout the talk. So many things to talk about, I'm sure, but this is a chance now to move over to the Q&A section. So I'm going to now hand over to Zahra, who's going to be moderating that session.
Thank you, Marcus, and thank you, Ruba, for such an engaging and wonderful discussion. Just a reminder to our attendees, if you would like to ask a question and you haven't already done so, please use the Q&A icon. We have about 20 to 30 minutes, so I'll best to get to all of the questions. So let's dive in. Ruba, the first question asks whether there are any stories that you may have uncovered where a lower level slave might have been able to ascend or be able to increase their rank in society by virtue of their artworks.
The immediate answer is actually yes. We know that there's a study of silks and the work of silk and taffeta in Bursa in modern day Turkey, and that idea of the slave artists. But in general, that notion of the person whose skill can get them out of slavery is actually mentioned in the Quran. And then after that, it's mentioned in these legal sources, and they talk about that there's slavery within Muslim context have different levels and different definitions of enslaved people. And one of them is the enslaved person who has a contract towards manumission, which is called the mukatab. And the scholars all argue that the person for whom this applies the most is the skilled artists who can become free. Now, do we know of someone who says that I've become free of that? We don't. Ibn Khaldun mentions that, he talks about it. There's lots of hints towards it, but I think we have not yet began to uncover the material, because there's so much and it needs I think an army of people working to uncover this. But I know that in Bursa, usually especially with prisoners of war, one wonders, and I'm not a specialist on that, so I'm not sure I know how to start, but one wonders, for example, these accounts of Tamerlane saving the prisoners who have a craft, who are skilled in the crafts, and sparing them and sort of taking them to work in after sort of war and demolition in whatever city was at the time. I think that might be something very interesting for us to look at, where these enslaved and given a mukatab contract. These are conversations that we need more people to work on, and we need to start having as collaborative groups.
Thank you. I'll just continue with the next question in regards to metalwork as well. And this question is about the signatures.
Yes.
And it asks that, you talked about the legal relationships between artists and craftsmen, but it's sometimes the case in calligraphic networks. Are there any evidence of familial relationships inside these workshops?
Yes, I think we have lots of evidence of familial relationship. I haven't seen that. Let me separate the question in two parts. We have large evidence of familial workshops, for example, in ceramics. If one thinks of the Abu Zaid family network in Kashan in the late 12th, early 13th century, where you have a family working together on what almost sure at the time was a secret recipe of creating ceramics. So we know they worked as a family workshop. We have evidence from the Timurid period of metal workers who are brothers working in different aspects of metal work. So we know of families working together in workshops. The workshops I work the most on in Mosul, for example, I haven't found evidence of a familial workshop. I know that Julian Raby, in his most recent article on Mosul, identifies what he thinks may be a father and son, but he raises the question and says we need to know more about them. And unfortunately, I haven't worked on them yet, so I don't know. But generally speaking, one knows that if one thinks of even more 150 years ago, when crafts were transmitted through families, through apprenticeship, it is we should start with the assumption that we probably will find them. It's just we don't yet know how to read the evidence for that. But I found interesting evidence for families working in different areas. So, for example, in Mosul, we have in one of the workshops, in the workshop of Ahmed al-Dhaki, for example, one of his ghulams is working as a metalwork inlayer, and the son of that ghulam is a hadith scholar. So we have people doing different things within a single family framework. So hopefully we'll know more.
Thanks. The next question asks whether by law children were allowed to make or sell art, and what did that serve in the society?
I have not come across this at all. Let me start by saying I've been working with Islamic law sources, I think for around 15 years now, and I don't think I've scratched the surface. There are areas and periods that I'm very familiar with because I've worked on the art from that period, and the material is vast. So I don't think I've looked at all at children and the rights of children. I know the material is there. So I can tell you that in the sections, you'll be surprised, but sections on transactions between individuals, including families, so things related to marriage and divorce and sort of taking care of children and so on, are in the section on transaction, not in the section, of course, on acts of worship. So there's material there, but I'm not familiar with it.
Thanks. The next question asks whether the legal aspects of style, design, and techniques that you discussed with metalwork also apply to textile design, and are you aware of research on this area?
With textiles, I'm more than have a doubt that actually, yes, we have a very, very regulated and more complex tradition than we tend to think of it. One of the main sources that people use is I think it was published in the 50s, no, actually in the 70s, R.B. Sargent, who published a research on textiles, trying to understand the names of different types of textiles based on the accounts in historical and geographical sources, and discussing these through the materials they're made of and how they're made of. When I was reading in legal sources, and there's so much on textiles there. There is a study of early legal scholars, for example, from 9th century Baghdad, and the percentage of those who are either textile traders or related in some shape or form to textile industry is huge. So in a sense, every legal scholar seems to know about textiles so much because that's their bread and butter. They were not paid at that time. So when I was reading, it was clear to me that the legal scholars are not telling us only on the type of textile, they're actually telling us how the textile is made. They're telling us whether the textile has a design or a drawing, a raqm on it. They're telling us these, but this all still needs to be studied. The only person I know who has been doing work on that is Corinne Mulliman from, I think she finished her PhD just recently, and she and I were in correspondence while she was working on that material. But she worked on one aspect of that material. There is so much on textiles, so I'm encouraging people to really look at textiles. How much it will increase our knowledge of them. I can, for example, tell you that the discussions of the slipped my mind, the name of the background material that, for example, linen is covered with so that you can apply design on it. Who applies that, and what happens if a textile gets spoiled while this is applied because of the way it is applied. So here you have a source telling you how things were done in the 11th century that we don't have any other source to tell us about that.
Wow, thank you. The next question is about whether in legal documents you've uncovered about what a mosque should look like, despite the fact that mosques are almost always regional expressions.
Yeah. The short answer is no. legal sources do not discuss mosques. They discuss prayer. They discuss the modality of prayer. They discuss the orientation, of course, towards the Qibla, the direction of prayer towards Mecca. They discuss the fact that Muslims pray side by side. They discuss a desire for separation between men and women while they're praying, but not that they should be in a different floor or behind a wall or a different part of the building. None of that. None of that exists in legal sources. Until now, actually. So there is no designation of shape and form, and mosques have always evolved and developed based on local architectural styles, which makes them incredibly rich and varied and interesting to work with. What is different is that with the in a sense the maturity of the Ottoman mosque model, with the dome and the minaret, and the fact that it is under the Ottomans in the 16th century that a fatwa was issued that, well, everyone should pray. Everyone should pray Friday prayer. It's no longer just few people who would pray it. It was something that happened in the 16th, as late as the 16th century, and of course, because the Ottomans was the last caliphate before the dissolution of the caliphate in 1923. All the Muslim majority nation states, when they became new nation states, they built a national mosque, and the national mosque was based on some derivation of the last caliphal model, the Ottoman model. So the dome of the minaret are born out of the 20th century, not Islam in the 7th century.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Just closely related to this idea of the Islamic city, is there in the legal text mentioning anything about the form and the shape of the city itself?
No, not at all. I think because there is nothing, so there is no section in the legal texts about the city. You won't find that. What you will find, for example, in the discussion of tax, you would find sections talking about how much would the tax be on goods and agriculture within the borders of the city, whether the city has a wall or not. And they would tell you in the legal text that not all cities have walls. And then how much would the tax be say, 2 miles out of the city, and then what is the tax on the badia, on the sort of on the the hinterland of the city or in deserts. So there is no morphology, neither for the mosque nor for the city. Having said that, once you start reading, for example, if you remember that section where I talked about the early mosques that have the space around them, the ziyada, or the organic growth around them, it is not a discussion of morphology. It's a discussion of what happens for the people who spill outside the mosque. Can they pray in a building next to the mosque? Can they pray in a space next to the mosque? Can you add a space that's next to the mosque into the, can you expand the mosque into it? So the questions are about prayer. The discussions are about prayer. They're not about the physicality and materiality, but those of us who are familiar with the physicality and materiality can relate to, actually, this is how it translates physically. This is how we can explain, for example, these organic growths that suddenly stop and then people start building multiple mosques.
Thank you. The next question is about the relationship, or whether there was a relationship between Islamic law and gardens. Did the text talk about gardens in urban spaces at all?
Only in the sense of gardens as produce, so orchards in a sense within the city, and how much they're taxed, and you tax them or not. They were not taxed inside the city. Outside the city they were taxed, but there's nothing about the design of the garden, the shape of the garden, and so on. There's a lot about in a sense the produce of the land. If you, for example, have a garden and you dig and you come across what's called the rikaz, so it's mining. If you come across minerals, if you come across petrol and so on. So there's that discussion, because when something becomes a public good as opposed to a private property, but not design, not garden design, none of this exists in Islamic law.
Okay. The next question is about epigraphy on buildings,
Yes.
and somebody's asking how we should be able, how one can sort of evaluate that, and are they considering legal sources?
Inscriptions on buildings, especially on religious buildings, are mentioned in legal texts. And they're mentioned in more than one way. One is what's suitable to be inscribed, for example, in a mosque. And one is whether anything, including Quranic verses, is suitable to be inscribed in the Qibla wall. So when in the usually most decorated wall in the mosque that Muslims face in the direction of prayer, which is usually lavishly designed and full of inscriptions and, you know, beautiful mihrabs and so on, legal texts do discuss that even inscriptions from the Quran that could become, that could sort of, what's the word, take the attention of the worshipper because it's in their line of vision, those should not be allowed. And now, this is where there are different layers of things being banned or allowed, or, you know, it's not desirable. But there's always a discussion of anything in your line of prayer. And I, of course, wonder, because most of the niches, the decorated niches in mosques in the direction of prayer, the mihrabs, are very high, and most of the Quranic verses very high. And there's always the discussion that, well, they're not meant to be read because you just have to know them. And if someone is worshiping, they know that they're there and they probably know what the verse is. And when I was reading this, I was wondering, is that a reason why they would be this high? Of course, I don't know. I haven't, it's just made me ask the question. I don't have answers for that.
Mm-hmm. And the next question asks about whether there are any legal discussions about cities that talk about urban and spatial practice and people in the streets and in public areas.
The quick answer is definitely there is. And it seems, from what I read and what I know, it seems that North Africa, the school of law that is most dominant in North Africa, which is the Maliki School of Law, has produced a few legal manuals related to the space of the city and the width of the street and so on. Legal texts work on principles, and there's a principle called la darara wa la dirar, which means don't create harm and don't, in a sense, be harmed by what's happening. And there's for example, a jurist called Ibn Rami, who wrote a book called Kitab al-Jidar or Kitab al-Jidran, the Book of Walls. And in that, he talks about neighborhoods. What's the good neighborly behavior? Do you open a window overlooking the courtyard of your neighbor? What's a good neighborly behavior for the space of the street? So this exists, but it seems to be, and if I would like to be corrected if I'm wrong, I don't know. I've only come across it in Maliki texts, and very specific texts. And our colleague Simon O'Meara from SOAS wrote a book on fez, specifically using one of these legal sources. So the principle is common in all different schools of law, but it seems that in North Africa they elaborated into this tradition of, I think, under the general idea of fatwas or legal discourses, to talk about the space of the city. So they do exist. There is a book that was published, I can't remember when, by Basim Hakim, what comes into these books seems to be inspired by this concept of la darara and la dirar, but it's all based on Maliki law. And there are bits and pieces in other schools of law, but nothing substantial and nothing elaborate.
Thank you. That's fascinating. The next question asks whether the formal colonial rule in Islamic societies has had any impact on the relationship between law and materiality.
Quite a lot. I think one should answer this by saying yes. I think one of the places to start is up until the canonization of Islamic law, which started in the 19th century, and then the creation of fixed laws based on European models, which took place again, end of 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, and then of course became enshrined under the nation states. Islamic law is historically was a set of principles in which jurists discuss discuss differences and changes related to the context of where these rules are discussed. So in a sense, the law is not fixed. The principle is fixed. What the law, the spirit of the law is fixed, but the application in different places was different. So with that Western effort to create an image of itself in the canonization of Islamic law, it I think one can say it sort of restricted that incredible openness and difference, the concept of ikhtilaf, which is legal differences amongst the schools of law and within the schools of law. And we see that in material culture extensively, because of course, if you look at it just created separation. It created complete separation because Islamic law as a field of study developed from the West, looking at the East and casting the East in a certain look. So, my work on the Friday Mosque, our study and knowledge of the Friday Mosque to date has been shaped by something like a drawing that was created in the main book that was teaching history of art from the 1800s all the way into, I studied it when I did architecture in Jordan a quarter of a century ago. It was the same book. And that represents Islamic architecture with a mosque, and that mosque has a dome and a minaret. So in a sense, the die is cast from the outside and applied to what we all learn and study. But the field is changing and is revising quite a lot of these materials.
Thank you for encapsulating all of that. So we have a lot of questions, but I'm going to just ask one final question, which talks about whether and how legal sources might speak to works about pilgrimage, and whether they how they might be able to negotiate, the idea of sacred as well as trade and commerce.
Mm-hmm. Again, the sections on pilgrimage are in the ibadat section, the acts of worship section. So it is focused on the modalities of pilgrimage, on the behaviors one do, the steps one take, the time of pilgrimage, what's allowed and what's not allowed in pilgrimage. It's these things that are fixated, and when it comes to in a sense physicality, the only thing that is mentioned, as far as I can know and see, is the Kaaba. And the question there is, if you're in Mecca and the Kaaba is in the middle, which direction do you pray towards? Which is a valid question. The Kaaba is everywhere. So these types of questions, and then it becomes so the notion of trade. From everything you see in the legal sources, Islam has always encouraged trade of goods as well as trade of ideas. People traveled and traded, and the pilgrimage was first and foremost, in addition to being this in a sense sacred right that is prescribed for Muslims, it's a place where people meet and trade goods and ideas. So the markets around, I have not personally read anything around the markets around the spaces of pilgrimage. But maybe that is because most of the scholars, the jurists that I've read, are writing from different parts of the world and writing about going to pilgrimage. I have not yet a source, say from the medieval period, that is a jurist writing from Mecca and maybe commenting on space there. So you always have to think, what is the context in which this jurist is writing, and you know, I can assure you that a jurist writing in 11th century Afghanistan is giving different examples than someone writing in 14th century Egypt. So maybe the information exists, but I don't know.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you for all the questions, and thank you to all the attendees as well. And I'm going to pass it over to Dr. Milwright.
Well, thanks so much. I mean, thank you, Zahra, for moderating that discussion so well. And so it's my job now to bring this event to a close. And I could see from the questions that there were many other points that we could have got at, and I think it reflects what a wonderfully rich topic this is. So I'd like to just finish off by thanking a number of people who have worked very hard to make this event happen. So I'd like to thank Barb Biggs in the Art History and Visual Studies Office, Mike Houston, Dave Broom, John Threll for the Dean's Office in Fine Arts, and of course Zahra, who's been working so hard for us in the last part of this session. And of course, huge thank you to Ruba for both the wonderful discussion that she gave in the first part, and then also these thoughtful responses to the questions. And last of all, also just a massive thank you to you, the audience, for being there. We love to be able to put on events like this, and also for the terrific questions that were put forward. So just in closing, I just wanted to mention that we will be posting up this event onto the Fine Arts YouTube site, and you can see the address on the screen here. And we will be, you can also see on there the previous Orion talk with Jennifer Beichwell, I'm sorry. And we will be doing more events like this, and so look out for those on the Art History website, and we'll be posting up those on social media. So thank you to everybody, and have a very good evening.